Mr. President, members of the court, it is an honor to appear before this court on behalf of the Republic of South Africa. We appear before the court pursuant to General Assembly Resolution 79/232, which requested an advisory opinion on the obligations of Israel in relation to the presence and activities of the United Nations and other international organizations and third states. This resolution was initiated by Norway and supported overwhelmingly by member states. We make these submissions while Gaza is once again under a complete siege following Israel's breach of the ceasefire brokered by the United States, Qatar, and Egypt. Israel has also intensified its aggression against Palestinians in the West Bank. Israel is blocking food, water, and medicines, all of which are essential to life, from entering Gaza. As cited in this court yesterday, the United Nations Secretary General stated that Gaza is a killing field. He added, "Aid has dried up, the floodgates of horror have reopened." On 11th April, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights reported that Israel, and I quote, "appears to be inflicting on Palestinians in Gaza conditions of life increasingly incompatible with a continued existence as a group in Gaza." Palestinian NGOs and major aid groups have warned that Gaza is entering into famine and that, in their words, the humanitarian aid system is facing total collapse. This collapse is by design. Israel's Defense Minister, Israel Katz, said on 16th April 2025, and I quote, "Israel's policy is clear. No humanitarian aid is about to enter Gaza. There are no preparations to enable such aid." Under the world's watchful eye, Palestinians across the occupied Palestinian territories are being subjected to atrocity crimes, persecution, apartheid, and genocide. While we watch, the gaze of Palestinians is directed squarely at the international community and this court, whose advice is urgently being sought for the protection of their most fundamental rights, including the right to life. The scale of the harm inflicted on Palestinians by Israel was laid out in detail in oral submissions made yesterday. We wish to emphasize the impunity with which Israel is inflicting these harms. Israel continues to act with impunity as it does enjoy some form of exceptionalism from accountability to international law and norms. Conversely, any person or entity which seeks to hold Israel to account for its inhumane and unlawful actions is subjected to countermeasures and censure, from which the United Nations and this court has not been spared. In this context, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, which was established after the 1948 Nakba, is but one of Israel's latest casualties. UNRWA is being attacked in furtherance of Israel's goal to deny the inalienable right of return of Palestinian refugees, the restitution of their land, homes, and property appropriated since 1948, and to further its apartheid policies and practices. The attacks on UNRWA are also deliberately imperiling the existence of Palestinians as a group. Mr. President, members of the court, turning now to the court's jurisdiction, South Africa considers that the court's jurisdictional requirements have undoubtedly been met. In relation to judicial propriety, South Africa observes that the court had, in its 19 July 2024 advisory opinion, dispensed with the arguments raised by some states in this proceedings. The court held that the arguments did not constitute compelling reasons to decline to give the advisory opinion then. The same reasoning should apply now. In the interest of brevity, South Africa will not repeat the court's long-standing and clear jurisprudence on this aspect. Providing an advisory opinion does not require the court to prejudge elements relevant to the contentious proceedings in South Africa versus Israel, which South Africa argues based on facts and law, that Israel is in breach of the Genocide Convention. The question asked of the court in the present matter concerns Israel's obligation as an occupying power and its obligations as a member of the United Nations, and specifically the legal consequences arising from its acts and omissions in these contexts. The court has extensive facts available to it by virtue of the dossier transmitted to it by the United Nations and the submissions made in writing by states. This is despite Israel imposing an information blackout, including through prohibiting the entry of international media and by killing journalists. Israel is also denying access to the occupied Palestinian territory to UN agencies, persons and entities mandated by it to investigate Israel violations of Palestinian rights. Accepting Israel's argument under the circumstances that this court has insufficient facts before it would be rewarding it for its own egregious conduct. Any further actions by Israel that censor remaining humanitarian organizations requiring access, UNRWA in particular, would contribute to rendering Israel's conduct unreviewable. The international community cannot accept the reality in which an entire civil population is deliberately starved by Israel, where the United Nations is evicted and deprived of its immunities and privileges, where third states and humanitarian organizations are prevented from rendering humanitarian assistance in solidarity and in fulfillment of their erga omnes obligations. Nor can we accept that journalists, aid workers, and first responders are being assassinated and then hastily buried in mass graves. The United Nations is rightly seized with this matter and calls for the court's urgent advice on the questions put to it by the General Assembly. Mr. President, members of the court, this brings to an end the first part of South Africa's oral submission. I kindly request that the court calls upon Ms. Nokukanya-Jele, the Special Advisor to the President of the Republic of South Africa on Legal and International Affairs, to address it on Israel's obligations as an occupying power. I thank you for your attention.
Mr. President, members of the court, it is an honor to appear before you on behalf of the Republic of South Africa. International law prohibits Israel from the use of starvation as a method of warfare, including under siege or blockade. Israel may not collectively punish the protected Palestinian population, which it holds under unlawful occupation. The UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, in his report of 17 July 2024, stated, "Starvation reflects a state's fundamental abandonment of its human rights obligations," and further, that the State of Israel has deployed the full range of techniques of hunger and starvation, perfecting the degree of control, suffering, and death that it can cause through food systems, leading to this moment of genocide. Despite the horrific attempts by Israeli officials to characterize them otherwise, Palestinians are human beings. They are flesh and blood. Palestinian people are entitled to the same fundamental protections as we in this great hall of justice. And this includes the right not to be arbitrarily deprived of life, the supreme right from which no derogation is permitted, even in situations of armed conflict. Israel's humanitarian blockade, including its ban of UNRWA, renders the Palestinian population significantly less resilient to Israel's acquisition of territory by force and of its genocide. In so doing, Israel is breaching the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people, a peremptory norm of international law enshrined in the UN Charter and Common Article 1 of the International Covenants on Human Rights. Furthermore, Israel is impeding the United Nations and third states from exercising their erga omnes obligations and international solidarity with respect to the exercise of the fundamental human rights of the Palestinian people, which this court held to include the right to self-determination. In relation to Israel's obligations towards the United Nations, the 1946 General Convention provides for no exceptions to the inviolability of the United Nations, which applies equally in times of peace and in armed conflict. States are under a legal obligation to protect the inviolability of all UN premises and property, wherever located and by whomever held. Israel must therefore cooperate in good faith with the United Nations and render it every assistance. And despite its abrogation of its bilateral and operational agreement with UNRWA, Israel's obligations under the UN Charter and the General Convention prevail. Mr. President, members of the court, turning now to the legal consequences which flow from the question before the court. South Africa submits that Israel's unlawful occupation and its aforementioned violations of peremptory norms of international law constitute internationally wrongful acts attributable to the State of Israel. This necessarily invokes the law of state responsibility. Israel must therefore immediately cease its internationally wrongful acts and make reparation in full, including through restitution, compensation, and satisfaction. Israel must comply with its obligations as an occupying power to ensure food and medical supplies and facilitate the unhindered provision of humanitarian goods, essential services, and development assistance by the UN, third states, and other international organizations. It must fully cease hostilities to ensure their ability to deliver assistance. Israel must comply with this court's binding provisional measures in South Africa versus Israel and take effective measures to ensure, without delay and in full cooperation with the United Nations, the unhindered provision at scale and by all concerned of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to Palestinians in Gaza. Finally, Israel must immediately reverse its decision to expel UNRWA and other UN bodies from carrying out their mandated activities. Turning to the obligations on the United Nations, the United Nations and its bodies are under a duty not to recognize Israel's internationally wrongful acts, such as its unlawful eviction of UNRWA and its unlawful powers reserved for the legitimate sovereign in Palestine. And despite Israeli restrictions, the UN and its agencies, including UNRWA, must continue to render humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people. It must demand and negotiate for the removal of barriers imposed by Israel. Turning to the obligations on third states. Third states have an obligation not to recognize as lawful Israel's internationally wrongful acts, including its banning of UNRWA, not to maintain these acts and to collaborate to bring such acts to an end. It is imperative that third states refrain from providing arms which enable Israel's continued breaches of international law in the occupied Palestinian territory. Mr. President, members of the court, in conclusion, South Africa shares the UN Secretary General's view that the world has failed the Palestinian people. The only certainty they have is that tomorrow will be worse. Therefore, we must save whatever is left of our humanity by ending Israel's unlawful settler colonial occupation and its intentional starving of the Palestinian population, who are being systematically brutalized and deprived of the most elementary considerations of humanity. Palestinians look to the world and to this court for an end to their enduring loss, their pain, and their suffering. Mr. President, members of the court, This brings to an end South Africa's oral submission. I wish to thank the court for your attention.